Good morning. Oftentimes when people see me, they ask, where's Bill? How's Bill doing? What's he been up to lately? It's not often, though, that I'm asked to take his place, which, as folks who know him know, that's not an easy task. So I'll do my best to channel Bill Dyson, but I'm sure I won't live up to that. So have a little patience with me, please. What I would say in channeling Bill to start off with, though, is that let's all take a breath. This is not an easy conversation to have. Addressing race head on, dealing with the history that we've had in this country and trying to make a difference is not easy. But if we commit to doing it, we can make a difference. And what I'd like to do this morning through this panel discussion is put a little window into the world of the Racial Profiling Advisory Board in terms of how we've been making a difference in this arena. As Ken mentioned, we've been doing this work since 2012. It was actually when the DOJ came in and looked at the East Haven Police Department, and in terms of civil rights violations, that the spotlight came back to Connecticut. We had a law on the books since 1999. It's 2011. Why didn't we know this if we're collecting this information? If we're seriously looking at this issue, why didn't we know this? And we knew with a new governor, a new legislature coming in, that they would want to address that there would be heavy incentive for them from their constituents to want to do something about it. And it was about that time when the Department of Transportation informed the new executive branch that there was resources available. Something that had never been dedicated to the Alvin Penn Act was really resources. But here was a significant amount of money that was available to be able to do something about it. So the first thing, and they looked to Central, the executive branch, was Mike Lawler at the time, and said, hey, would you be willing to go after this grant and see if you can't bring some resources to the table? And the first thing that we thought is, we can't do this alone. This is too big of an issue for us to do alone. We need to get a collective of people that are impacted by this, that are involved in this, and we need to collectively do this together, because there's no way, shape, or form we'll be able to do this by ourselves. And the person that we picked to chair, we had co-chairs at the time, John DiCarlo was a police chief, was Bill Dyson. This is my turn to say, as I think a lot of people know, he has a special quality, special characteristic of bringing people together, of being a fair actor. And so he's chaired this advisory board since we were put into statute in 2013. We just had a meeting yesterday, and he's still at that work, 79 years old doing that work, and because it's important. So when we first were tasked with looking at this, we got a group of people together, and we went to the legislature saying, hold on, again, you please, can you take a breath and see if we can't help collectively solve this with you? And we were able to convince that of them. And two of the people that were part of that group are sitting here on this panel, people that have also been dedicated for that amount of time on a consistent basis, showing up and having the difficult conversations and helping us come together on this issue. And they are Mike Gailor and Tamara Lanier. And you have some information on your packets about individuals on the panel and their background. What I'd like to start with is just from Tamara's perspective, and Mike and whoever wants to go first, what was that like in the first days? What was the community like? What was law enforcement like? What was it like in the legislative executive branches? And take us back a little bit.
Wow. Well, my name is Tamara Lanier. I am a retired chief probation officer, a 27-year veteran of Court Support Services Division, and I'm also a 25 or greater year veteran of the Connecticut NAACP, and currently the vice president of the New London branch, and my president, Jean Jordan, is sitting in the back. But Andrew, and one of the things, I will just be honest, there was a lot of anxiety and frustration initially. And for me particularly, I remember having a conversation with Senator Winfield at the time because my concern was that the discussion was moving from Alvin Penn's experience. He was a senator at the time who had been repeatedly stopped and profiled over and over again. And he was very frustrated with that, and he was at a time talking about racial profiling when nobody really understood what it was. And so I felt that he had suffered for that legislation, and it was important to me that his name stay on it. So I remember having a conversation with Senator Winfield and saying, why are we not calling this the Alvin Penn Act or updated Alvin Penn Act? And he said, it's a work in progress. So, and that very much encapsulated everything that it was at that time, a work in progress. We were working, we were moving in the right direction. It was not only the NAACP and other people, other stakeholders, ACLU, but it was a difficult conversation to have with law enforcement because at that point, and Ken talked to the importance of data collection and data analysis, at that time the question was, does racial profiling really exist? We were having difficulty getting people to understand what it was and that it was, in fact, something that permeated Connecticut law enforcement and the communities that they served. So it wasn't an easy time. There were a lot of adversarial conversations, a lot of difficult conversations. And as a group, we have worked beyond those issues, and we're coming closer together in terms of understanding what's going on in the communities and trying to resolve the issue of racial profiling.
Thanks. Mike, you know, this was a time we're going to hear later from Ben Crump. You know, this was a time when Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin were really at the height of our consciousness, and I know law enforcement was feeling the heat from that, and in Connecticut as well, especially through East Haven. So,
good morning, and thank you for having us here. The Division of Criminal Justice has been trying to address this problem since its inception, and Ken referenced it originally when he spoke, that the division was originally designated to do a report, an annual report on racial profiling. The problem was there were no resources committed to that. Police officers were collecting information. They were collecting information on paper. They had nobody to collate the data. They had no place to send the data, and we had nobody to analyze the data. So it really was insignificant. There was no really way for us to analyze that. And of course, we don't have anybody on staff who's a statistician who has the capability of doing the type of analysis that was done. When the project first was brought to us when they talked about restructuring the Alvin Penn Act and forming this advisory committee, I volunteered to jump on board right away because we recognized the importance of this problem. And the best thing that happened was getting everybody in a room together. First, to identify what racial profiling is and to have that discussion. The second discussion was, what information do we need to collect? And that seems like it should be an easy issue to resolve. That probably took us 6 months to a year, I would venture to guess. It took us 6 months to a year to figure what information do we need to collect. The next question was, how do we analyze that data? And that took us a long time to figure that out. And that's why I think we ultimately came to the conclusion of doing the 7 tests, because one just wasn't sufficient. And finally, and Ken referenced this as well, data is a jumping off point for the analysis. It doesn't necessarily mean there's discrimination. It's a question of how you analyze that data and what you do with that data. And that's why I think Ken and the folks from Central have been absolutely fantastic in working with police departments to try to understand what is the cause of this, what is the cause of the disparities. So this has been a wonderful project. I think we have worked with, all the various groups have worked well together, and there's probably one other piece that we really haven't mentioned here, and that is the interplay between the data and the public, and the police and the public. Trying to bridge that gap, try to correct the lack of trust, try to build a bridge of trust between the police and the public. And that comes with transparency and understanding. Each side has to listen to what the other has to say. And only when that happens can that happen. And this project, I think, has been fantastic in doing that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the data collection here and the analysis. But I hope we don't lose sight of the public outreach, which has been a huge part of this.
Yeah, certainly. And I know in the initial public forums that we had, and I see Deb Delpret Sullivan in the back, and she was a part of this as well, it was very much anecdotal. It was very much, hey, this is my perspective on why this happened, and from the police and from the community, this is my perspective on why this happened. And we didn't really have an answer for that. I mean, we didn't have, per Mike's comments earlier, all the information that we needed in order to come into that situation in a rational, neutral way and say, yes, this is happening or isn't happening. And we had the benefit of the time of, at the Institute, we're really project managers, and we oftentimes bring on expertise. And one of the folks that we brought on was Jim Fazzolero, who was an Office of Legislative Research researcher, a nonpartisan who had been working for 35 years. He was working at the General Assembly when Alvin Penn was there. He understood the law and how it came about. He understood all of the traffic laws and how they came about. So actually understanding the kind of bones of this was really important. But then when it got to the high-level analysis, we realized we really needed to bring in someone, and that's when we brought in the economists. And I know Dr. Stephen Ross was overseeing Matt Ross, no relation, who was also at Uconn, and Jesse Kalinowski, both of whom still work with us and do some of the really high-level analyses that Ken was talking about that now are being used, for instance, and have been modified by them, but are being used in Rhode Island, in California, in Oregon, and the like. But Dr. Ross, maybe you can talk a little bit about the value of data in this conversation and your understanding of it.
Well, I first want to note that I played no real role except an educational role in teaching Matt Ross, who was a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Connecticut, when he and Ken met and started working on this problem. It really was all Matt and his fellow graduate student Jesse Kalinowski who worked with Ken to draw on the literature and put together this set of tools that are being used to look at racial profiling. And I think Matt definitely deserves a huge amount of credit for the work he did. I'm actually sort of in some ways at the table in large part because of my many, many years working on discrimination actually in housing and mortgage discrimination. That's a much easier job, and I want to take a couple minutes to sort of note sort of how difficult the problem is that Matt and Ken and others have been working on. If you're working on housing discrimination and you're sending testers out to landlords, you get to observe the fraction of minority testers who get shown the apartment. You get to observe the fraction of white testers who get shown the apartment. That's not true when you're trying to study police stops. You only see the people who were stopped. What does it mean that 20% of the police stops in a jurisdiction involve minorities? Nobody knows. What do you compare it to? The 20% by itself is sort of meaningless. We're missing half the data. And that's something I just think everyone should take away from, that's the difficult challenge when you're studying police stops. We actually, no matter how much data we collect, half of it is always missing. And so what we're always having to do is trying to make a guess. a guess as to what is a pretty good approximation of the composition of the people who might have been stopped in this sort of counterfactual world where minorities and whites are treated perfectly the same. And that's sort of a goal that can never be reached. There are just various strategies that we can apply and try to accomplish that. If we're looking at pedestrian stops in an urban residential neighborhood, then it's a pretty good looking at the composition of who lives in the neighborhoods by race, age, gender. On the other hand, automobiles go everywhere. People only walk half a mile or a mile. Automobiles go everywhere. You can't use who's living in the neighborhood for sort of benchmarking what the automobile stops look like. What are some of the techniques that have been used and used in Connecticut? As was alluded to with the veil of darkness, when night falls, it's hard to see through the windshield. The inside of the car is dark. It's very hard to identify the race of the motorist. Until a police officer stops the car, they don't know whether the motorist is white or African American quite often. So if we could be looking, for example, at the evening rush hour on a certain area of the state or a town, and night falls, it becomes more difficult to see, to identify race. After night falls, that is going to tell us something about the racial composition. Similarly, we might look at the racial composition of accidents. If accidents happen, they're relatively random. We might see that 15% of the accidents involve African Americans in this area, but 25% of the stops involve African Americans in this area. These are never perfect. They are guesses. They are approximations. In economics, we typically call these our counterfactuals. If I was a doctor involved in a medical control trial, they would be the control group, right? But in this world, it is sort of an approximate control group, an approximate counterfactual. And I think that goes to why Ken spent so much time talking about the idea of this preponderance of evidence, these 7 different approaches, because you'll never know whether there's racial profiling. It's always going to be, well, we see evidence here, we see evidence here, we see evidence here. That's suggestive of a problem. We need to look more carefully.
Thank you. And, you know, one thing I'll say is when the DOJ came in and they analyzed East Haven's traffic stops, they used one analysis tool. And so that preponderance of evidence they didn't even have when they did that. But what they did was they then went and looked into the agency in a number of different ways. And you know, one of the things that's often confused about this report and this process is when we talk about the work that Matt and Jesse have done with Dr. Ross and how he explained it, they think that's the end-all and be-all. But no, that was developed as a screening tool. We have, what are we up to now, 109 departments? 107 departments by which we have to figure out where are you going to dedicate resources, if any, in terms of actually delving in and peeling back the onion on this issue. And so this was used and is primarily used as a screening tool. Which department or departments should we look at the most? And so that has happened over the past several years where we've done the reports. And as Ken mentioned, the next step to us, in many ways, is the most important step. And that's the one where we actually go and figure out what's going on. Are these disparities justified? I guess in the scientific process, you have the hypothesis through the screening tool, and then this is where the rubber meets the road. Is it actually true? And the fact of the matter is, as we've found it, we've never not been shown disparities on the local level when we peel it back. The screening tool that we've used has always, when we go and do those secondary analyses, shown us that those disparities do exist, But the real big question is, why do they exist? And one of the departments that we identified in the past couple of years was the Madison Police Department. And we have Captain Race here from the Madison Police Department, who I know worked with Ken and Jim over a series of months to look into that. So both Captain Race and maybe Ken, if you want to talk a little bit about that process, what it meant to you from the perspective of the police department, what potentially you had heard about the project, and not knowing too much about it, because we often hear that departments have a perspective on the project, and then when they actually get to see it, it maybe changes a little. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Again, I'm Captain Joe Race from the Madison Police Department. After I think it was the 2017 statistics, it signaled that we did have a statistical disparity in the rate at which we stopped was Hispanic drivers for us in particular. One thing I will say about Madison, and not just to give us a pat on the back, is we're a CLIA accredited agency. And what that means for us is that we're willing to have those hard discussions and look at our operations all the time. And that's become kind of the fabric of what our department is. So when we see a problem, whether it's internal, external, the statistics, we're going to take that on and we're going to address it. Because the idea of accreditation, it's about, like we said, it's about progress. It's not perfection, it's progress. So when we were notified that there was a potential issue, we welcomed the opportunity to sit down with Ken. Chief came into my office and said, let's get all these statistics together and let's find out where this problem is. Let's find out what the issues are, what the factors are. And we were happy to sit down with Ken, and the way that he approached us and worked with us, obviously, as we know, cops, we don't really want to be told what to do. It's the alpha personality, it's what we do. So it's a difficult conversation, and again, this racial conversation is not easy, especially when you start talking about someone's livelihood and law enforcement officers and how they stop. And when you tell them the way you're stopping is incorrect, or the rate at which you stop someone is signaling that you might have a racist proclivity. So it's a difficult conversation to have even as an organization, but with the individual officers. So when we had the opportunity, again, we welcomed Ken and the project down as soon as they could, because we wanted to clear it up, and we wanted to know that if there is a problem, that we're going to address it. And that was with us, that was the thing, is there's something that we're doing incorrectly, and if there is, we're going to fix it. And as we went through the process, the town of Madison is between 94 and 96% Caucasian. But our motoring public is vastly different, as we were just mentioning. Hammonasset State Park is our southern shore. Depending who you talk to, it has between 1 and 4 million people that come in and out of that park. Like 1 million cars, 4 million people, something around that number. It's a tremendous amount of people coming in and out of the park that aren't from Madison. So that changed substantially our motoring public. So we were able to sit down and peel back even more layers than that first glance that gave us the statistical impropriety, and we pulled that back to be able to see what those other factors are. And I think it was refreshing that it wasn't that, we made the list and now we're in trouble and we have all these questions to answer. It was, hey, here's an issue, can we sit down and discuss it? And we welcome that opportunity.
Thanks. I'll just share quickly that having worked now with 28 municipal departments across the state since 2015, these are really hard conversations to have, and we've had them now 28 different times. On top of, we also manage the initiative in the state of Rhode Island, so we're having similar conversations up there. And it's always really refreshing, and it sets the tone for where we're going to go when you walk into a police agency and the attitude isn't one of a defensive posture. And I think, in the case of Madison, the example that they provided was one of full transparency, and one that said, we don't know why we showed up, but we want to know as much as you know. And we're going to give you as much information as we can so that you can help us make a more informed decision about what we do and how we do it. And along the way, we were also able to become more well-informed. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and it's been mentioned a few times, there's 107 police agencies in the state of Connecticut. There's one full-time individual and a number of part-time individuals and researchers it's a small number that are responsible for every year in a cost-effective way trying to figure out if disparities exist in departments and what to do about it. And so I always call what we're doing triaging, right? To do the level of analysis that I think every department in this state would benefit from on an annual basis, like the level of analysis we did in Madison, I'd be producing an analysis of 2013 data in 2023, because that's just how time-consuming it is. And so we've developed a process that we believe is fair. Whenever I'm out talking to the public, I try not to say just because a department wasn't identified doesn't mean that there aren't people that are having experiences in those communities that, you know, might not be appropriate or they might feel is profiling. Okay? And I don't want to sit here and say that people aren't feeling a certain way. But when we're trying to use data to inform the conversation, we try and do it in as fair a way as possible. Everybody knows ahead of time what the thresholds are for being identified. And, you know, believe it or not, it's actually pretty hard to get identified. And so it was both refreshing and rewarding to have the experience that Madison provided, which was, I think, the right tone and the right sort of approach that law enforcement could take, which is to not be afraid of this. Oftentimes people are afraid of the data because they're not sure where it's going to lead them, and they're afraid that if it leads them to a place that is maybe could appear to give the department a black eye, then they want to do all they can to protect against that. And what I found is those departments that we've worked with that have leaned into it, that haven't been afraid of whatever the outcome might be, have benefited the most from this process. And I think Madison, along with a number of other agencies, have been some of those departments that, rather than taking a defensive posture, leaned into it, embraced the process, and we're better informed now as a state about what happens in Madison and the nuances of Madison and how it interplays with Hammonasset State Park and some of their major roadways, and right, than we were had they not taken that approach. And so I think that helps to set the tone for other agencies.
And in terms of setting the tone, again, I'll go back to Bill. Bill's a gentleman that grew up in the segregated South. I mean, he grew up in Waycross, Georgia. He was in the lunch counters in the 60s. Had been dealing with race issues himself, you know, publicly in terms of running for elected office, trying to get into higher office, and easily could have come to this position in the kind of mindset that you see really predominant in today's political landscape, you know, one of kind of lobbing bombs and stepping back and, you know, seeing where the carnage is. But he had always come at it with a perspective of, this is not going to be gotcha. If we're going to move the needle on this, we got to do it together, because otherwise, yeah, maybe we take one step forward, but then there's going to be 2 steps back, and we'd rather take those steps forward together. And so I think that philosophy has guided this project throughout, and I think we've been consistent with that, and I think it's been extremely helpful. And it's not to say that we can't get better with it. I think we're always striving to get better, but that guiding philosophy has helped us all stay at the table and feel committed to each other's success. One thing that really is important to that is that we not just do it in the room that we're at when we're having these meetings or when they're in the back room putting together analyses, but that the public understands what's happening. And I think that's always something that we're striving to do a little bit better. And it's unfortunate Chief Higgins wasn't able to attend, but because we came across him, you know, we've known him obviously through the work that we do, but he was a part of a public forum that we had in New Haven. And that conversation in New Haven, also the chief of the New Haven Police Department, who's the now chief, who was acting at the time, was there as well. And it was a very rich, honest conversation about this. And we're in the process now, and you can go onto the website. It's ctrp3.org, and take a look at some past public hearings and conversations. We have John Lucas, who's our visual content editor, who's done a lot of great video work with that. You can see some snippets and the like. We got a few coming up. But I'd love to talk, Tamara, I know you wanted to talk about, how is the public viewing this? What is the perspective now, 8 years later, that we're having this conversation? Is there a value to the data being part of it? What do you see?
Well, I want to start by saying key to improving the police effectiveness and the community relationship is a healthy dialogue between the police and the population they serve. And for me personally, what I've observed in going out, I can tell distinctively between the communities where they have that civic engagement and the communities where it's not present. And the reaction when we come out and we start these discussions where there's no relationship, no foundation, those are tough forums. And in forums where we see that there is a healthy police-community relationship, there's a dialogue. So that's one thing that stands out for me personally, and it shows that the police have some work to do, because particularly in the communities where there is no dialogue, those are the communities where we see the tension. And so it's important that they start the process of discussing their mutual goals and the trust and the transparency that needs to be developed between the police and the community.
Just to add something, and Ken had mentioned that we're always trying to improve the process to make it better for everybody. One of the things that we realized that one of the problems we would have in establishing the communication between the public and the police was the fact that the report was coming out, initial report was coming out, identifying a police department with a disparity. Then we would later do a supplemental report where they would, after Ken and his folks had done a deep dive into the department, and sort of explain what might be some of the causes of the disparity. We realized that that was causing a little bit of some tension between the public and the police. The police felt that they were being stigmatized and not having the opportunity to be able to explain what might be the causes of some of these disparities. So one of the changes that we've made, and I think it's actually been a very good one, I know the police have been very receptive to it, and I think the public has as well, is to do the analysis, identify the police departments, conduct that deep dive with the police departments, and then issue the report so that the public can see the whole picture. And it's not just numbers, it's numbers with it's data with information. And I think that's probably been one of the biggest changes we've made in the last couple of years. And I think it's been very significant.
Great. Well, what I'd like to do now is bring the audience in. I have a few other questions I can ask the panel, but certainly this is meant to be a conversation. You've heard that we've had this conversation among ourselves, but whenever we're also out in a public setting, we want to hear how we can do better, questions that you have, thoughts that you have. So we would welcome that. Anyone? Yeah.
So the Sentencing Commission is about to has embarked on this study on disparities in pretrial and in sentencing to respond to the legislative mandate. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice for us. If you can advise us one thing, what would that be over the course of the next year?
I'll comment, and then maybe I'll kick it over to maybe Steve, too, because I know he's doing some work on the idea of disparities in sentencing. And I think it goes back to the last slide that I presented. Anybody who's sitting in the room today who is tasked with evaluating disparities in any aspect of the criminal justice system should know that you're likely going to find disparities, because we see, right? We see it. We know they exist. And so we're probably going to find them. We're probably going to find that there are disparities in sentencing. But we've got to just, right, the slow and steady wins the race. Rushing to conclusions isn't going to benefit anybody. Making sure that you're building a product that is comprehensive and holistic and takes into account all the complicated factors that go into sentencing, as there are complicating factors that also go into right, our analysis, and then having a discussion about it and figuring out, okay, what does this mean? Getting results in data is only the very beginning. Then sitting down with the appropriate actors, say, what is this telling you? Okay, and then I'm going to go and study it, right? So that might sound sort of academic and sort of wonky and sort of, but a number of times we'll go into a police department and we'll say, well, we're finding a disparity here. I'll give you a quick example. Went into the Waterbury Police Department a number of years ago and found a significant disparity in registration violations. A lot of Hispanic drivers being stopped for unregistered cars. And so the conversation, well, help me understand why this could be happening. And it says, well, it's not a race thing, it's a socioeconomic thing. Okay, so we know that our Hispanic population is poorer than our white population. It costs money to register our vehicles. And so, they're more likely to be driving around unregistered vehicles. Well, do we know if that's true? Okay, how do you deploy your license plate readers? How do you deploy your resources in looking for unregistered vehicles? And when you drilled down on the data, what you found is that the Hispanic neighborhoods were significantly more likely to be exposed to law enforcement running their plates. And so they found unregistered vehicles, and then they came back and they said, see, look, this community has unregistered vehicles, and therefore they must be a socioeconomic problem, and we've created a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so when, in fact, we ran experiments in Waterbury to test the theory that, socioeconomic factors could be what's driving unregistered vehicles, and that could be correlated to race, what we found is that there wasn't evidence to support that. And I think even the department was surprised by that. And so the goal is you go in and you say, okay, we have this data, we find this disparity, but we don't really know what it means. You tell me what it means to you. Okay, I get the theory, I get the logic behind what you're trying to do. Now let's go and try and figure out if that can be supported by data. And when in fact we found that white drivers were 7% more likely to be driving around in an unregistered vehicle when the similar exposure rate to having their license plate searched, the department reworked their strategy for where they placed license plate readers and how they looked for unregistered cars. But if we had just simply stopped the conversation by saying we found a disparity, the disparity is that too many Hispanic people are stopped for registration violations, see you later. Who would have benefited from that? The department would have said, well, there's a high number of registration violations because of the socioeconomic factor, and that would have been their excuse, and the community would have said, well, you're targeting me, and I feel a certain way about that, and it would have further divided law enforcement and the communities they serve. So you have an obligation, if you're going to go down the path of evaluating disparities in any system, to not just point out disparities and walk away. You have an obligation as an entity, as the Sentencing Commission, as the Racial Profiling Advisory Board, to follow that up so that people can be better informed. And our goal is to always create win-win-win scenarios. How can I help law enforcement keep communities safe? How can we reduce or eliminate racial disparities? And how can we build trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve? And that should always be the mindset when using data. And you've just got to be careful that you're not exasperating the problem by dropping a bomb, saying, you got some problems and I'll see you later. You have an obligation to see it through.
And the other thing I'd add to that is just the legitimacy portion is who's at the table when you're having that conversation. If it's going to be legitimate, the product that you have to make sure that it's the people looking at it are representative of who's impacted by it. And oftentimes that isn't done. Oh, Steve, go ahead. And then we'll
So I just wanted to say that we know when we look at disparities, we're going to find disparities because we know there are such striking differences across society between minority communities and white communities and resources and history, just because of the history of this country. And again, I'm the type of guy who's going to go to the data and talk about this. If you look at mortgage markets, even though there's massive differences in the outcomes for minorities and whites in mortgage markets, once you control for underwriting variables and you look within lenders, specific lenders, how are the whites and African Americans being treated, the differences are almost always minimal, whether it's my analysis or other individuals' analysis. It's only when you look across lenders and across neighborhoods where you start seeing large differences. On the other hand, in racial profiling, for example, in Texas, Matt and I are looking within individual patrol officers. And even within officer, you still find these very sizable racial differences. So that essentially, if you are sort of controlling for the differences that should matter to explain these disparities, and it's explaining a lot of the disparity, then you have to wonder what else could be out there that we're missing, that the deep dive would make those disparities go away. But if you keep pushing at it and large disparities remain, then this is probably something that is real that we need to take a careful look at, right? And sort of that's a part of this approach that we'll use with the Sentencing Commission. We know there will be raw disparities. The question is, when we sort of control for all the things, for example, that bail commissioners collect, will we have wiped out 90% of those disparities or 20? And that will help sort of us understand where there are disparities that are sort of really persistent and those that aren't.
So another question? Oh, sorry. Tamara one, and then we'll go on to the next question. Sorry.
And I just wanted to add, firstly, that we're talking a lot about data here this afternoon, but we can't lose sight of the individual behind the data or the communities behind the data analysis. And those justice-impacted people who are in communities where we see these disparities, how they are not only justice impacted, but emotionally impacted by the trauma associated with racial profiling. So we're talking a lot about data, but I don't want to lose sight of the impact that racial profiling has on communities of color. And when we talk also about the data collection, there are disparities all throughout the criminal justice system. And I also liken this to the data collection and analysis to things I'm doing in the community. So if you're a part of an organization that has been identified as or associated with disparities, are you looking at your data? Are you making decisions that are based on data? Are you making decisions that are emotional decisions or ocular decisions? Or are you drilling down and looking at the numbers and making your decisions accordingly? So this is transferable. It's not just in policing. It could be in criminal justice. It could be in CSSD. It could be with prosecutors. It could be, again, it's transferable. So we all need to be looking at the data in terms of when we make decisions, when we know that we're dealing with disparities.
Thanks. And just to follow up in terms of not just being about the data, one of the things that the project has done over the years is brought in federally funded DOJ training on fair and impartial policing. And also, we've had the benefit of a relatively newer advisory board member, Dr. Cato Lorenzen, who brings a public health perspective to this for us. And it's I found it extremely valuable. He presented not this last advisory board meeting, but the one before on trauma and the impact of trauma on policing and stops and the like of that. And if you start to view things that have happened nationally and otherwise through the lens of trauma and what it means to be pulled over, if you have a perspective or an experience, and how that stop can go a certain way based on how that interaction occurs, I find it's been very helpful for us in our considerations. So I know you had a question over there.
Jordan Harris, University of New Haven, NAACP. I just find it interesting that when we talk about policing, and especially including white people, they're constantly figuring out what racism is. And it just amazes me throughout history that like you could just go back to the exonerated 5. You didn't realize racism existed. I'm growing up in a generation with Michael Brown, Philando Castile, black women being forgotten in the conversation about policing as well, and they still don't understand racism exists. And I think that's where the frustration builds up for the black community. And when you talk about like a seat at the table, I think another problem is that like we don't see people of color having a seat at the table when it's needed, especially in public. So when we talk about even advocating for one another, I think even hiring faculty, especially I know at my school, that's what we want and that's what we're pushing for is more people of color that look like us within the faculty, because there should be no reason why you have one token black person in your faculty. So I think even advocating for that as well. When we talk about policing, my question towards that is, how do you encounter or how do you discuss with officers that are hell back bent on that alpha mentality, like you mentioned, that I'm not going to change my mind, I'm not going to change my ways, because there are young people that are growing up and that have that mentality and that are like, these racial disparities, these statistics don't really exist.
Well, I will say when it comes to law enforcement, we do probably a more thorough background check than anywhere else. All right, but do people still slip through the cracks? They absolutely do. I think with what we do, there's no cop working anywhere in this country today that wants to have another bad cop working next to them. And I think with things like our internal affairs process, and as we know within the state, especially recently, with legislation that's been passed, and we have a statewide model policy on accepting complaints. Were there departments that weren't accepting complaints? There were. And hopefully we're trying to fix that. It took some pushing from the General Assembly and obviously from the public to push it that far for that to happen. But I will say as we go through, as we look at things, we try incredibly hard between background checks. I mean, the number of people that are disqualified from this job because of all different things in their background, and we look at everything. We look at every aspect of it. We look at, everywhere they've been, everywhere they've lived, people they've lived next to, people they've talked to, things that they post. We go back through all of that to try to find all those things, but people do still make it through. And that's where we have the complaint process. And any agency, every agency should be willingly accepting those complaints so they can look at those. Then through the internal affairs and the discipline process, hopefully we're getting rid of those officers. Again, there is no cop that wants to work with a cop that is using race as their only reason for stops and arrests and things of that nature. So I think we try very hard, but I mean, there are exceptions always.
I'll add, too, that one thing that we don't talk nearly enough about, and it's a growing field of research, is something that we call masculinity threat. And Professor Phil Goff out of John Jay College in New York, he runs the Center for Policing Equity, has done a lot of research in this area. And what he's found is that masculinity threat is actually, it's more dangerous than racism in policing. And so they've actually run a number of tests where individuals that score high on, it's not what it's called, but I'll call it like a racism assessment, but low on a masculinity threat assessment scale are actually significantly less likely to use force than officers that score low on the racism scale but high on the masculinity threat scale. And so some of what I think the profession has been forced, particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, to try and grapple with racism. And because of that, the conversations become much more nuanced around race. Because of that, we grapple with what are proxies for race in some situations. But something that hasn't been paid nearly enough attention is this idea of masculinity threat. And how do we assess that? How do we ensure? And what that really is, right, is that is an individual that right, doesn't like to have their quote-unquote masculinity threatened. And so what that means is that if I pull you over and you start talking back to me, right, I might be triggered, and I might not be racist at all, but right, I'm not as comfortable in my skin with my authority, and so I am much more likely to overreact to that situation, to overcompensate for that. And so that's another aspect of this I think isn't explored nearly enough, that impacts sort of the culture of the profession in some cases, and that is probably a much harder thing as a police administrator to try and suss out, right, and to try and be aware of and to try and be mindful of. And what I will tell you just from our data, more experienced officers, when we do officer level analyses, tend to be much less likely to be identified with disparate outcomes in stops, in searches. And part of it is because, right, the more experienced, the longer they've been on the job, they know when to search a car, they know when to, right, when to push, when to pull, when to back off. And so some of it is a lot of the individual officers we identify in our analysis tend to be newer to the profession, which tells us something, right, about the role that experience plays plays in policing and the importance of it and the importance of partnering with younger officers with more experienced officers, maybe for longer periods of time, and putting more oversight on those younger officers, but all things that should be a part of the discussion.
And also, to your point, I've been heartened by the fact of universities willing to take this on more. I know last year we had Michelle Alexander at Central Connecticut State University in this room here. Not that long ago, you had Brian Stevenson. He was getting a Dodd Prize Award. And I know, Mark, you were a part of 13th, which was a tremendous documentary that I know is being shown across campuses. So, Tamara?
I just want to add that the best tool to fight discrimination is diversity. And when I say diversity, I don't mean diversity for diversity's sake, like just promoting someone of color because they're a person of color, but someone of color deserving of the position and not afraid to challenge the status quo when they see something wrong. The more diverse your unit is, either your law enforcement unit, your office is, the less likely you're going to have acts or incidents of discrimination. And I think that diversity creates a healthy discussion. And also, people are less likely when there is diversity to show their, for lack of a better word, ignorance about other cultures.
So we have time for one more question.
Hello, I'm Malik Champlain. I'm a parole officer for the state of Connecticut, also a doctorate student at Uconn. The question I had was, has anyone up there who analyzed the data, have you looked at your positionality in the data that you received, both quantitatively and qualitatively?
In terms of what position they hold within the department?
Yeah, and what they bring, right? Culturally, like where they come from, their position, right? Because I guess what I heard, at least, from the panel when you were speaking was that I was asking myself questions like, when we talk about race or the idea that we default that it's difficult to talk about race, is that influenced by the position of the people who are in power and what race they are? So when I was questioning like the positionality is like, what do you bring to the table as well as the data that is also being brought to the table?
So I hope I'm not obfuscating your question, so I'm going to try and answer it as directly as I can. And the truth of the matter is that I'll be honest with you, it's not something certainly that I've given a lot of thought to about my own position, right, as one of the lead researchers, right, on the project, my own position in society and within the university and our organization. I have tried to, as somebody who is a certified Department of Justice implicit bias trainer, I've tried to work hard to raise my own consciousness of my own biases that I bring to the table. And the truth is, I'm only aware of what I'm aware of, as is the rest of the team. And I think one of the best ways that you sort of address what it is that you're talking about is you try and ensure that you're not the only one in the room. Meaning, I'm not the only one meeting with law enforcement or not the only author on a report. Because we're all of us, and there's a number of authors on each of these reports and a number of people that look at the same information, and we do all draw different conclusions sometimes. And sometimes it's a matter of trying to recognize that, maybe sometimes I'm too quick to accept an explanation for something, and what I rely on is that somebody else on the team is less quick to accept the answer given and thinks about it in a more unique, critical way. And so I think that what you've done today is actually, it's a really good question. I'm likely going to ponder for some time after today, so I appreciate that. But I think, the best thing that we can do as an organization is ensure that the team that is going in and working with police departments and assessing and evaluating disparities is diverse and comes from a diverse group of backgrounds and ways of thinking. And one thing that we strive to do, and if I'm making an honest assessment, we probably don't do as well as we should, is ensure that more members of the public are included in these conversations on the front end. Oftentimes they're included more on the back end. It's, we've done our research, we've found results, we go out into the community and we say, here's what we found, and here's what it tells us. And then we've had a very small number of instances where the community was participating on the front end, meaning they were in those initial meetings with law enforcement. We were having those raw discussions about what data meant and what it didn't mean. And those conversations were much different. And so, you know, in ways in which we look to improve, what we know is that, you know, that's likely something we should be taking and doing more of. So I hope that somewhat answers your questions, but I appreciate the question.
And I know certainly from my perspective, you know, I grew up in Farmington, and you know, all the way through, you know, I graduated from high school there, and although I had friends from Hartford through Project Concern, you know, we played sports together, they stayed over at my house. I certainly didn't have, and I went into Hartford a lot in terms of, you know, I took lessons and whatnot, but my perspective has changed dramatically since I've now lived in Hartford for 30 years. And understanding some of those relations that Tamara is talking about in terms of policing and the political systems and the educational systems. And, you know, I really kind of consider myself to be someone who pays particular attention to people and relationships. And, you know, that has been important to my understanding, but much to Ken's point, you know, we're limited, you know. We can always learn more. And I think you bring a valuable question to us that we should have at the forefront of everything that we do. Thank you.
So I think where Ken went is sort of is the right way to think about this is when you're running your statistical analysis, the big problem is it's impossible to ever say you know the truth in terms of cause. All you're going to have is a pattern of data. And so you always have, if you're going to actually have an impact in the real world, you actually have to go at a deeper level of analysis that requires subjective judgment. In the mortgage market, where I have much more experience, the Federal Reserve did this for years, which was they would investigate individual banks with statistics, they would find problems, and then what they would do is they would do file reviews. They'd pull the file. Well, the problem is if you're pulling 3 or 4 files, and every file has 50, 60 different pieces of unique information about that mortgage that was put together, there'll always be differences. It's always possible to find a difference. And so there is this very difficult question is what is the person who's doing the file reviews bringing to the table? Do they have a disposition to find explanations, or do they have a disposition to not find explanations for these racial differences? And there's a very hard problem to sort of get around. I think to one extent, Ken mentioned the idea of implicit bias. I also work in education, and right now there's sort of an explosion right now in education research looking at this concern about implicit bias, where you can see people responding differently to very race-neutral questions in ways that sort of indicate a sort of a positive or negative view of minorities. And I think this concern about implicit bias, whether it be among mortgage lenders or researchers or police officers, is something we're going to be talking about over the next decade. One of the striking things, however, oftentimes when you do this empirical research, and maybe this actually suggests a big role for implicit bias rather than animus, is oftentimes both in housing and mortgage markets, when we have really good testing data, we find virtually no difference in the level of discrimination we document based on whether the agent is a minority or a white, right? So we have African American real estate agents, we have white real estate agents, but the level of racial differences in treatment to minority home buyers or renters appears to be very similar. And to some extent, if there's sort of an implicit bias in the real estate industry that might be driving this, it seems to be an implicit bias across the entire industry, right? It speaks not as much to animus, but to sort of all the experiences and things all of us were raised with and thoughts we were raised with that's going to be very hard to change.
All right. Yes, no? All right.
I guess they asked me to have the last word. What I would suggest to everybody is take a look at the racial profiling reports that have been done by the folks, Ken and his folks, and I want you to take a look at those formulas, and there's going to be a test at the end of the day. Anybody who can answer questions based on those formulas gets a free dinner.
Thank you all, and I appreciate the opportunity.